Matthew's already been using it. This is not the first time he's doing it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but suffice it to say that Matthew is no stranger to the use of irony. And of course you can make that argument already because although Matthew is the first one in the canonical order, most of us, me and Jerry especially, would argue that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest. And Matthew kind of uses Mark as a nice, hey man, thanks for sharing that outline with me. I'm going to populate it a little differently, right? But if that's full of irony, it's probably a good chance that Matthew's not going to stop doing that, right? He's actually going to play it up quite a bit. Now, I hope the next slide here is going to be helpful to you a little bit in addition to your handout. We're going to look at least trying to, okay? Like, oh, you don't have to take notes. So it's not a big deal, all right? But I've tried to sort of frame this for us a little bit, okay? Just so you can see it in kind of a few different, I guess, rectangular shapes, if that helps. For some people that helps, okay? Now, we've talked about it, yeah? We talk about identifying parallels. We call them markers sometimes. The fancy word in italics, again, like I said, I wrote this for nerds, right? And sometimes you have to like use special terms and all that stuff. Anyone know what that word in italics is? Okay, Stichworte. Okay, it's German just for key. It's a keyword. Okay, and it's like it looks good. People are like, oh yeah, he knows what he's talking about. He's read some German guys. Yeah, okay. Then it persuades those guys with the PhD that gives you the PhDs. That's why you do it, right? But the key words, the key parallels, right? Mount of Olives. Donkeys, all right? And also, not only donkeys, they're also called, right, beasts of burden in both texts, right? And that gets placed in both in Samuel and in Matthew. Other markers, yeah, city of Jerusalem, the royal acclamation. We've all talked about this, okay? But I'm just putting you in here. So the proposed intertext, yeah, 2 Samuel, both 15:30, we have the beast there, and 16:1 and 2. Okay? Brings this whole thing into the picture. Now, there's a fancy word up there too. We don't have to talk about it too much. David, you know what we're talking about. David's he's one of my grad students. Gets extra credit for being here because he's awesome. But we talk about this sort of like a metaleptic reading. All that means is exactly what I said earlier, is that when we're called back to a specific passage, we don't want to read just that one verse. We're called to read the whole larger context of that verse, that chapter, that book. That's what a metaleptic reading is. But again, fancy words. Now, here's the thing, right? We always have to ask ourselves this. All right, Mark. All right, whoever. You're arguing for this connection. Okay, well, what's the point? Whenever someone says something, right, there should hopefully be some sort of point. It should kind of help make sense of what Matthew's talking about in general, right? Why? What's the actualization? What actually happens if we read it this way? Well, I think, okay, that the reason why Matthew might be doing this, right, why he might be alluding back to 2 Samuel 16, is to highlight Jesus as the righteous and true king. Okay? That makes a lot of sense to me, because that's kind of what he's been doing since chapter 1. Okay? So there's nothing sort of strange about that. Now, here's the other thing, though, and here's where the irony comes into play. Because, yeah, Jesus is the son of David. He's from the line of David. He fits into that whole messianic framework. But by evoking this passage, I think Matthew is also emphasizing what proper kingship is supposed to look like. It's not just to proof text something. Okay? It also is like, well, what is a king actually supposed to be doing? And remember, Zechariah around, like, here's your king, meek, lowly, riding on a donkey. That's part of the picture. Okay? And that is ironically not always how David was presented or how he presented himself. Okay? And it's certainly not how Absalom presented himself as wanting to be the sort of usurper after David, right? Absalom rides in there, in fact, on horses and with chariots, which is complete opposite of what a king's supposed to do if you read Deuteronomy 17. The king's not supposed to have many horses and a big army, right? And Absalom's doing all these things, right? So Jesus is not an Absalom. He's not a David. He's something else. And of course, the Absalom Revolt, just like Jesus' entry, right, begins this whole big deal in Jesus' passion. Who is going to be loyal to the true king? That's the key in both of these stories. Loyalty to the true king. And guess what? Some really important people are going to be turncoats. They're going going to betray him. David was betrayed, and Jesus was betrayed. So what are some of the conclusions, and I call them narrative implications of this? Well, like I said, there's certainly, right, an ironic sort of narrative implication here. Matthew is using 2 Samuel in an ironic way. Okay? Jesus enters, David exits. Politically speaking, Jesus also, is going to suffer the death of a criminal on the cross eventually, whereas David, politically speaking, is going to be victorious by exiting. Right? David's going to preserve his kingship by leaving Jerusalem up the Mount of Olives on these donkeys. Jesus is going to also ultimately be victorious, but in the interim, going to suffer the most horrific, humiliating defeat a son of David could imagine, right? Crucifixion next to criminals. But Matthew, of course, I think has already primed us to see that, okay, there are some ironies here, and still there are some twists and turns to come. Now, some scholars here they can't see this. Okay, they just think, no, this is not right because David is leaving, Jesus is entering. This is not an appropriate parallel. This is not intertextuality. Okay? But again, I would say, well, I think you don't understand necessarily what irony is. Right? Don't necessarily understand what irony is. Because even then, the triumphal entry is going to be the beginning of a huge segment of irony in Jesus' passion. It's riddled with ironies. Okay? And the same in the Gospel of Mark. And again, this irony, I think, is also part of Matthew's greater aim. He's of presenting Jesus as the one who is greater than Solomon, who's greater than David. This is part of the strategy in subverting these types of things. So the fact that we have an ironic entry of Jesus versus David's exit should not surprise us in and out language being used in ironic ways. I just want to call your attention, just briefly, I just want to mention it, in Matthew 2:15, okay? Just to give us some context. He's done this before. In Matthew 2:15, Matthew's talking about the Holy Family, right? And they're fleeing from Herod, who is going to murder all the Jewish baby boys of Bethlehem. And so they're fleeing, from Israel into Egypt. And then Matthew says, oh, and this happened in order to fulfill what was written, right? Out of Egypt I called my son, which is a quotation from Hosea 11:1. And you're like, wait a second. Out of Egypt I've called. Well, no, he's going into Egypt to escape it. And you're saying it fulfills out of Egypt. How does that work? Well, here's how it works. It works if you are aware of irony, right? Because what if Matthew knows exactly what he's talking about? And what if Matthew is quoting this passage in Hosea 11:1 because he is framing Herod as Pharaoh and Israel as a spiritual Egypt? And I think that's exactly what he's doing. Because that's how Jesus' opponents are going to be framed in general, right? As enemies of the true King of David, right? Israel in Matthew is a figurative Egypt, all right? And Jesus